The old plan is no longer suited for a world that has become hostile and unstable. With that single admission, Mark Carney signaled something much larger than an update to Canada's energy policy. He presented what he described as a complete course correction, one that challenges years of assumptions about how Canada should power its economy, protect its security, and position itself in an increasingly uncertain world. At the heart of that shift is a simple but powerful argument. If Canada controls its own energy, it controls its own future. But that immediately raises a much bigger question. If Canada is determined to become more energy independent, what does that mean for its long-standing relationship with the United States? And why is Carney now arguing that the country's future depends on breaking away from what he calls an outdated model? According to Carney, Canada is confronting not one crisis, but three at the same time. An affordability crisis that continues to pressure households, a security crisis shaped by growing geopolitical uncertainty, and a climate crisis that cannot simply be ignored. Rather than treating these as separate problems, he argues they all point toward the same solution: energy sovereignty. In his vision, Canada must stop thinking of energy merely as a commodity to sell and begin treating it as the foundation of national strength. Economic resilience, national security, and environmental responsibility all become connected through one central objective: ensuring Canada has greater control over how it produces, transports, and uses its own energy. That vision becomes even clearer when Carney turns to what he describes as one of Canada's biggest strategic vulnerabilities. For decades, Canada has relied overwhelmingly on a single customer for its energy exports: the United States. According to Carney, that dependence has come with serious costs. It has left Canadian energy selling at discounted prices while exposing the country to unnecessary strategic risk. His message is that no nation should place so much of its economic future in the hands of one buyer. So instead of remaining tied almost exclusively to the American market, Carney lays out a strategy to diversify Canada's energy relationships with the rest of the world. The first step is making better use of existing infrastructure, including the Trans Mountain Pipeline, to reach rapidly growing Asian markets. But he argues that existing capacity alone is not enough. His proposal also includes developing a second West Coast oil pipeline, expanding Canada's ability to reach customers beyond North America. At the same time, he wants Canada to become a larger exporter of low carbon liquefied natural gas to both Europe and Asia. The reasoning goes beyond economics. Carney argues that by supplying reliable Canadian energy to allies overseas, Canada can also help those countries reduce their dependence on hostile powers. In that sense, expanding Canada's export capacity is presented not only as an economic strategy, but also as a geopolitical one. Yet, exporting energy is only part of the story. The bigger transformation, according to Carney, begins at home. He argues that electrification will become the engine of Canada's future economy, not simply because it supports climate goals, but because it can improve affordability and strengthen long term competitiveness. His projection is ambitious. By 2050, 7 out of every 10 Canadian households are expected to save money because electric technologies are significantly more efficient than their fossil fuel alternatives. That claim forms the foundation for the next stage of his vision. If electricity is going to power more homes, more industries, and more transportation, then Canada's energy infrastructure must expand dramatically. Carney argues the country needs nothing less than doubling its electricity grid. That means investing in an entirely new generation of infrastructure capable of supporting a far more electrified economy. But producing enough reliable electricity requires more than transmission lines. It also requires dependable sources of power. That is where nuclear energy becomes central to Carney's strategy. Rather than viewing nuclear power as a temporary solution, he presents it as one of Canada's long term competitive advantages. He points to Canada's history as a nuclear leader and argues that new reactors can provide the clean baseload electricity needed to support future growth. Beyond domestic supply, he also sees an opportunity for Canada to export its expertise, turning decades of experience into another strategic advantage on the global stage. Still, none of these ambitions can become reality if projects continue moving at the traditional pace. Carney openly acknowledges that business as usual is no longer an option. One of his biggest priorities is removing the bottlenecks that have slowed major infrastructure projects for years. His proposal calls for linking provincial electricity systems together into a truly national grid, creating a more integrated and resilient energy network. He also argues that permitting processes must be reformed so essential projects can move from planning to construction much faster than they do today. But speed, he insists, cannot come at the expense of partnership. His approach emphasizes meaningful Indigenous participation, including shared economic ownership in major projects, rather than simply consultation after decisions have already been made. Perhaps most notably, Carney argues for technology neutrality. Instead of placing all of Canada's future on one energy source, he supports drawing from a broad mix that includes hydroelectricity, wind, solar, natural gas, carbon capture, geothermal energy, and nuclear power. The objective is not ideological purity. It is building an energy system that is reliable, affordable, and resilient enough to meet Canada's future needs. Then comes perhaps the most politically significant moment of the entire address. Carney openly acknowledges that his government is changing its climate strategy. Rather than defending every element of the previous approach, he argues that the world itself has fundamentally changed. The climate framework developed in 2015, he says, was designed for a different international environment. Today's world is more hostile, more unstable, and those changing realities require different choices. That leads to one of the most difficult admissions in the speech. Carney states that emissions will likely be higher in the short term than previously projected. Not because climate goals have disappeared, but because the previous pathway was considered too expensive and too divisive under current economic conditions. His argument is that attempting to rapidly constrain Canada's oil and gas sector now would make life less affordable, while also weakening partners who depend on Canadian energy for their own security. Whether people agree with that conclusion or not, Carney frames it as a practical adjustment to changing global realities rather than an abandonment of long term environmental ambitions. Taken together, these proposals amount to far more than a collection of infrastructure projects. They describe an entirely different vision for Canada's future, a future where the country relies less on a single export market, a future where national electricity systems are connected instead of fragmented, a future where energy security, economic competitiveness, affordability, and international influence reinforce one another instead of competing against each other. Carney's message is that Canada should no longer see itself as reacting to events beyond its control. Instead, it should build the capacity to shape its own future through energy independence, diversified partnerships, and strategic investment. Whether this vision ultimately succeeds will depend on decisions that extend far beyond one speech. But the direction is unmistakable. Carney is arguing for a Canada that is more independent, more resilient, and more willing to redefine its place in an increasingly uncertain world. If you enjoyed this analysis, be sure to subscribe to Canada Today for more in depth coverage of the stories shaping Canada's future. Leave a like if you found this video valuable, and let us know in the comments, do you believe this is the right direction for Canada's energy future?